Okay, so
Krishna, maybe you asked us to remind.
yeah, I had done it. Okay, so in the previous section, we have discussed about models, the different types of models, and I have also talked about one-way binding, two-way binding, and one-time binding. Then I have explained the four different types of model and their features, which is JSON model, OData model, resource model, and XML model. Except OData model, all the three other models are client model, which means whenever the service is being hit, all the resources will be loaded into the client. Then whatever the operation that you are doing as filtering, sorting, they all will be happening in the client level itself. So since everything is happening in the client level, these models are intended for small data sets. But whereas OData server, it's a server model, which means only the visible part of your application, only those data will be loaded from the server into the UI. When if you're going to say, for example, there are like 25 entries to be displayed in the table and your table displays only 5 elements by default, then only 5 records would be loaded into the view and it will be displayed. Now when you're going to scroll in the table, SAP they have built that mechanism that during that time it is going to go to your server and it is going to fetch the remaining data and it is going to bring it back to the front end and it is going to display it. Okay, so that is what it is going to do. So, and I have told you about three types of binding which we do when we are binding with the element. So one would be property binding, then other would be aggregation binding, and the third one would be element binding. So in this exercise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you how to construct a JSON model. Then after that, I'm going to show you how to bind it to the control. So basically there are three types of syntax using which I can bind it. So one would be like curly braces syntax and other would be bind property method, and there is a one more thing which I will be there is one more thing which is actually I just got stuck, and other thing is the bind path binding. So basically these three things I'm going to explain and I'm going to show how these three types of binding is going to be done. So first let's get started with the property binding. So with the property binding, so before I show you how to bind it, I first have to construct the model. So in the previous examples we haven't created any models as of now. So in this example we are going to start with building a model. So I'm going to use a JSON model and the data that I'm going to bind it in the model. So that data I'm going to bring it from the I'm actually going to build the data on my own, like how the service would return the data. In the same way, I'm going to build the data and I'm going to say to the model that this is the data that has been received from the service. So based upon this mock data, we are going to build a model. Then after that, I'm going to perform the binding with the respective UI elements. Okay, so in order to build the model, we have this UI, we have this class called sap.ui.model is the library and JSON is the extension library of the model for the JSON model, and JSON model is the one that you have to instantiate for the purpose of creating the instance of the model. So once the instance of the model has been created, now while creating the instance itself, you can provide the service URL and then you can pass the data to it, or while after constructing the model, you can call a method called setData using which you will be able to set the data to the model. Okay, so this way you can perform the binding. Now when we talk about binding, basically there are two sources that are going to be interactive. One is the model and another one is the UI element which you are creating. So the binding is nothing but you have a property in the model and you have a model attribute in the model. So you are going to link a relationship between these two so that at runtime this the data in these in these two elements are going to be always in a sync. Now say for example, in the model I have a property called first name, and if that is going to have a value say something, and I have binded it to the input field, then whatever is the value that is there, that is going to be displayed in the input field. Now in the input field, if I'm going to modify the value, then that modified value is going to be updated back in the model. So they are always going to be on the sync, but in some cases you have to manually update depending upon the type of binding which we choose. So I'm only going to specify the name. At runtime, our control was designed in a way that it is going to look for the data and it is going to bind the value. So we explicitly need not do anything. Okay, so we have now assumed that we have now constructed the model. So once we have constructed the model, that wasn't sufficient to access the data. That wasn't sufficient for the control to access the data. So we have to set the model to any one of these three places. So depending upon that, you will get the access to the model. So you have created your UI elements in your application. Now this UI element, they have to be this UI element, they have to be binded with the model attributes. So before that, I have to set this model somewhere. So creating an instance alone will not suffice. So where are the places I can set this? I can either set it to the core, and remember the core is the central part of your application. So if I'm going to set it to a core, then it means my model will be accessible by all the views, all the controllers and all the UI elements that are belonging to that particular applications. Right. Now if I'm going to set it to a view, then only the controls or UI element inside that view will get the access to the model data. Now if I'm going to specifically set it to a particular control, say for example we have a table control, and if I'm going to, okay, in a view we have a table control, input field, radio buttons and so many other things. Now if I'm going to say that if I'm going to set the model, if I'm going to set the model to that particular table control inside that view, only the table control inside that view will get the access to the model data, whereas I won't be able to perform binding with the other UI elements that are available in the view. So clear till this point? Harish, I have unmuted you.
Hello.
Yeah. Okay. So we have created our model. Then we have assigned the model to any one of these following so that the UI element can get the access. So in this example, what we are going to build today, I would be binding the model to the core. Okay. Now the next thing is the property binding, so which we were talking about. So property, basically I have told you about two things in the control. One is the property and other one is the aggregations. So the properties are like variable, that is the individual values which is going to have 1:1 relationship. So I'm just going to assign a single value to that. Whereas when I say aggregation, it means I'm going to pass a array of values. So by the property binding, by the name you can assume that here I'm going to assign an individual value to a individual attribute. Okay, so there are three ways using which I will be able to perform the binding. So one method is called as a bind property method, then the other method is called as the curly braces syntax, and the last method, it is going to be a path binding method. So we will now take a look at each and every one of this method and we will see how the binding is being performed. So the bind property method. So whenever I am going to do the binding using the bind property method, then it means there is a method called as bind property associated with each and every UI element. So I create a UI element, the instance of the UI element is created. Then using the instance of the UI element, I'm going to call this bind property method, and I'm going to tell this method that you take this attribute from the control and you take this attribute from the model and you bind them both. So whatever is the data that is there in the particular attribute in the model, that data is going to be visible here in my view. So this method, it basically takes two parameters. So one parameter is called as a control property, that is the property from the UI element to which I have to perform the binding. Then the other property is called as model property, that is the property the property or attribute in the model to which I am going to perform the binding. So what I would do is I'll just go on and I will create an application. Then afterwards I will just start by I will just doing the binding syntax. I will be explaining the binding syntax one after another. So I will just go ahead and I will create a application project, file, new, and project. I choose the application project, then I click on next and I say
Hello?
hello.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, tell me. I'm able to
Yeah,
hear you.
still we are seeing only your PowerPoint screen.
Which one?
We are able to see only power. Yeah, your screen showing only PowerPoint screen only, not any SAP UI.
Okay. You are able to see it now? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, now it is showing that create application project.
Okay, man, you could have told that earlier. Okay, anyway, let me go back to the presentation. And so I was not aware about this. At least you should have told me. Okay, so basically the thing is that the first thing what we have to do is we have to instantiate the model. So whenever I'm going to instantiate it, I can either specify the service URL and I can say the model that you get the data from this, or I can construct the data by myself and I can pass the data to the model and I can instantiate them. Okay, so the model which we are going to build in this application is JSON model, which means I'm going to store the data in the JSON format. So the library for the JSON model is sap.ui.model, and JSON is the extension of that particular library. Then JSON model is the class that I have to instantiate. Then after constructing the model, I have to assign this model somewhere. Only after that I will be able to access the data in the model. I will be able to bind it to the UI element. So first thing that I have to do is, not the first thing, I can either do any one of this to bind it. Either I can bind it to the core. So you know that you can get the reference of the core using the method sap.ui.getCore of. So using that method you will be able to get the reference of the core, and set model is the method that is used to set the data, set the model to the particular place where you wanted to. Or you can, when or you have created your model in the view, sorry, you have created your model in the controller. Now you can, from the controller you can set it to the respective view so that the elements inside that view will be able to access it. Now if I'm going to set it to the view, only that view is capable of accessing. Whereas if I set it to the core, the entire application is capable of accessing that model. The third type is I can either set it to the control. If I am going to set it to the control, then only that particular control can get it. Say for example, if I am going to set it to table, only table will be able to access it. Other UI element within the same view will not be able to do the binding with it. So property binding, it's basically binding a property in a UI element with the property in the model. So it can be done in three ways. One is using the bind property method, then other one is using the curly braces syntax, or the third one is using the path binding. So I will just jump ahead into the system and I will just create a simple project, and I will be explaining you how these three different types of bindings are being done. Okay, now for example, I'm just I don't remember the number. It's okay, exercise 9. Okay, so I'm just going to use the commons library and I'm going to create it with the initial view. So I am just creating the view as main. Okay, so the first thing is the create content function. In the create content function, first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to build my sample data in the JSON format. So remember, I have told you that the data for the JSON would be within the curly braces. So I'm just creating a curly braces, then I am passing the variables. So I have also told you that the JSON data is going to be stored in the form of a key value pair. So the key is going to be, say for example, I'm just, name is the key and Kevin is the value. Then I'm setting the another attribute enabled, and this one I'm setting it as true. So now I have created a simple data in a JSON format. I haven't created any big data. I have just made a simple data. So I have created this object initializer, and within the object initializer I have created the JSON data in the form of a key value pair as it is supposed to be. Okay, so the service data, if you are going to look it into JSON format, it is always going to be displayed like this, the key value pair. So now I have my data ready. The next thing that I have to do is I have to instantiate the model. So in order to instantiate the model, I'm just creating a variable called oModel, and now you must be familiar that in order to instantiate the JSON model, I have to use this library sap.ui.model.json model is the name of the class that I have to instantiate. Now typically when we are instantiating it here, the first parameter that we would be passing is the service URL. So that will take the URL of the service, and it will go and hit that service, and it will get the data from that, and it will be loading it into the model. Now in this case we are not going to hit any service. Simply what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this data to be used by this model. So I tell this model that using the reference for the model, set data, I'm calling the set data method, and I'm setting this particular data that I have created as a mockup. So now this data would be loaded into this particular model. Right. So any doubts till this point? Harish, Ram, is it clear till this point?
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, you're giving value, right? Value-based modeling.
Yes, exactly. Okay. So once the model has been constructed, which one? Come again?
No, what I'm talking is here we are giving data as Kevin and true. I mean, this is the hard-coded value, right?
Yes, it's hard-coded value.
The same.
So this actually this is how the data used to come from the service. Okay. So this part. So we are creating a sample data on that part on the same type as the service would return, and I'm just binding it here. I'm just setting it to the model. Okay. Now I have to set the model to core so that all the controls that are available within this particular application would get the access to the model. So to do that, I have told you that there is a method called set data for the model, set model, using which I am assigning it to the core. Okay, now whatever the data model data that I have constructed, I have set it to the core. Now using this method, I can set only one model to the core. If I'm going to use this method, and if I'm going to set another model, I mean that data may be coming from another service, so that is going to replace this. So to avoid that, SAP has created a concept called named models, so that I would be explaining you in a different application. So in this application, I just wanted to teach you this. So if I'm going to do it this way, then this is going to be the default model for the entire application. Okay, so I'm just setting the model to the core. Then after that, I'm going to create a UI element. So I'm just going to create a input field variable o input is equal to new sap.ui.commons is the library, and text field is the name of the class. Right, so you are already familiar with this. Now I'm just going to pass the ID as say for example something txt, then I pass the settings. Now what I'm going to do is, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use the curly braces syntax. So first let me explain the curly braces syntax for you. So the curly braces syntax are nothing but, usually I used to hard code the value within the double quotes. Now say for example, if I wanted to set the value property of the input field to Kevin, then I would hard code it this way, right? So ideally I am passing the values in a double quotes. Now this time this value inside this is considered to be a hard coded, right? But Whereas I say that this value is inside this curly braces syntax, then it means it is not hard coded. So what system does is, in that case, it is going to go to the model that is associated with this input field. In this case, that would be O model, and it will go and look for the property called Kavin. So there is no property called Kavin. So what ideally I have to give here is, I have to give the attribute in the attribute name that is there in the model. So in the model, name is the attribute that is having the value Kavin. So since I want that value over here, I'm just going to specify the name of the attribute here with the curly braces. So usually we specify the value directly within the hard coding, but whereas I wanted to specify it as a binding relationship, then I specify it in a curly braces and the name of the attribute which is holding the value. Now this is going to take that, this is a binding syntax, so it takes the name attribute and it go to the model, and whatever is the value in the name attribute, and it is going to populate it over here in the value property at runtime. In a similar way, I'm just going to set the enabled property as well. So this value would now coming from enabled. Okay, so this is basically what we are saying is, to the control property, I'm saying that what is the model property that I have to get the value from. So that is basically what I'm saying. So this is the model property and this is the control property. So to the value, I wanted to get the value from the name attribute. So that I have specified, and now I would return my input field. Now let us test this application, and this is going to give us an error. It is going to give us an error. So you don't see anything here because it has ended up with error. So now what I would do is, I'm just going to execute it, and I'm going to tell you in the debugger what is the reason behind this error. Sorry, this is a different error actually. So I have to set it to the core, then I have to get the reference of the core, and I have to set it. sap.ui.getCore is the method that would return me the reference of the core, and using that reference I'm setting the model to the core. Now you can see that the input field must be displayed, but the value should not be coming, right? So the reason is that, I will also tell you a little tip. Whenever you are going to do something, if you see here, you are seeing this log here, right? So that log, it's basically written by the program. So this is the console, and the reference of this console is given to us in the program as console. So you just can say console.log O model. Now what would happen after instantiating the model and after setting the model? So whatever you have done, that is going to be returned to the log, and if I wanted any information, I will take it right away from the log. So this, you just use it for the testing purpose. Now if I'm going to run this application, you can see that my model value has been written over here as a log. So since I have set it to the core, I can also get it as variable model is equal to sap.ui.getCore of .getModel. So using this method, I will also be able to retrieve the value back from the model. Now if you see here, my model was constructed, and in my model there is an attribute called OData. So inside this OData only, it is going to hold the values. Now if you remember, I have told you that index.html file is the folder in which index.html file is available. That is going to be a root folder, because basically the web content is the root folder. So since the web content was created inside index.html directly, so I have told you that way. The basic thing is that the web content is the root folder. So whenever I wanted to access something inside the root, I have to specify that this information is available straight under the root. Now if you take here, the OData is the root, and the name and enable properties are available straight away under the root, which means I have to tell my UI element that you go to the model, in the root directory itself, you will find this variable and you bind it to that variable. So that is what I have to tell, but I have simply specified as enabled and name, which is the reason why it was not able to identify. So I have to go and tell that it is root. So in order to say that it is a starting point, it is from the root, I have to specify this slash symbol, which will specify me that it is from the root. Okay, now if you go ahead and if you refresh the application, you must notice that your UI element was filled with the value and the input field was enabled. Now see, if I'm going to set the enabled property to false, because I have set it to the enabled property of the input field, which means if it is true, the input field is going to be active. If it is false, the input field is going to be disabled. Now if you refresh, you must notice that you will get it in a non-editable mode, because the value Kevin is coming from the in the OData in the root directory. There is an attribute called name, it is coming from that. Similarly, the enabled property of the input field is coming from this enabled property. So clear till this particular point of time? Harish and Amit, sorry, Harish and Ram.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is one type of binding. Then the other type of binding that I would explain is path binding. So path binding, it's exactly similar to that of curly braces syntax, because I'm just going to pass the value as an object there as well. The only difference is being that I have specified the value as a 1:1, which means I have specified the value and I have specified the property and I have specified the value for that. But whereas in certain cases, I may have to pass the value, along with that I may have to pass different functionality as well. So say for example, I may wanted this to pass the value, along with that I wanted to pass the state of this input field as well, like whether it is a success state or error state or warning state. In some cases I may have to pass the I may have to pass the date, and then I have to tell that convert the date into this particular format. So I have to pass the value, I have to, along with that I have to also pass a method that will convert the date into that particular format. Likewise, not only the value, I may also have to pass different things to that. So if I have to pass different things, then what I have to do is I have to just, I have to specify it in a path. So what I'm going to do is, now instead of specifying the value inside the curly braces, I'm going to construct an object here, and this object is going to contain all the information on from where it has to look for the value and from which method it has to go for. So I'm just going to construct an object, and in the object I say that the first attribute is path. So the path is going to be name. So the path is an attribute from which it is going to take the value. Then if I wanted to say the value state, then I would be able to say the value state should come from so and so, or the formatter function should be executed so and so. So this thing we are not going to cover in this application, that we would do it in the later stage. So the path binding, it basically we are going to construct all the information that we are going to pass to the value in an object, whereas the value that should come from, I'm going to specify to the path variable, and the formatting function I will be specifying to the formatter variable. You got it? Now if I'm going to execute the application, it is still going to remain the same. So clear till this point, the path binding?
Yeah.
Okay, then the last type of binding, it's called as last type of doing the property binding, it's called as bind property method. Now say I have constructed my UI element already. Now while I'm constructing it, I do not know what is the value that I have to pass over here, which means I won't be able to specify the binding relationship. I mean, I can either do it, but what if I have two date fields, and depending upon the condition, say for example I have document date, I have posting date. Now depending upon the condition, either I may wanted to post the document date, or either I may wanted to post the posting date. So the variable to which I am going to bind it's going to be clear only at the runtime. So in those cases I won't be able to do the binding at the design time itself. So in those cases we have a method called bind property, using which I will be able to do the binding. So the bind property method, it's going to basically take two attributes. So I'm going to do this input field a binding. So I'm just taking the reference of the input field and I'm calling the method bind property, and in that method I have to pass two parameters. So basically one parameter would be the control property. So the first property that you have to pass is control property. So in my UI element I have to bind it to the value property, and for that value property I have to take the value from the model which is having the name, which is having the attribute as name, and it is there in the root folder. In a similar way I would bind property. Let's say enabled is the property, and I would say the value for this should come from enabled. So now if I execute the application, you will be seeing the same output because we have binded the same values, right? So this is clear. So this is basically the first parameter is the property in the control to which you wanted to bind, and the second property is the property in the model to which you have to bind. Hello? So clear with this?
Yeah, carry on.
Okay, so that's it with this particular session. Okay, and can you just suggest me any time tomorrow wherein we can sit for class?
Yeah, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock is okay. Maybe what do you prefer timing?
Can we do like this? I will do one session in the evening and other session in the night. 2 sessions. Is that okay?
Maybe yeah. That's
Like around 5 o'clock, one session on 5 o'clock and other session on 8 o'clock or something? 8 or 9?
check with
You can take like continuous 2 hours or something.
Which one?
Take 2 hours continuous.
I am not able to hear you clearly, Harish. Harish, I am not able to hear you. Come again. Hello.